Hello, Gustavo.
Hello there.
Hello. Did you have a wrong link? Could we send you wrong links?
Okay. Thankfully, Nicole sent me the correct one now. Thank you.
Thanks for sorting that out, Nicole. Hi, Gustavo. I'm Brett, so I'm chairing panel. It's an hour, well, just under an hour and a half now, but because it's just two of you, so you've got a bit more time than you might otherwise. So hopefully we can stick to the kind of 20 minutes. There's a 20-minute limit, but if you're going a bit over, then that's kind of okay. So yeah, so this panel is creating meaning through use. And so our first presenter is Nicole K. Stewart. And so Nicole, I'll pass it over to you. Am I sharing your presentation? I am. Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay.
For some reason, my Microsoft Teams is not working well.
Okay. So. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure to join you to discuss my research project, Platforms in Everyday Life. As I mentioned to Gustavo, as we've been emailing back and forth, I've been very behind because yesterday I defended my dissertation, which is based on this exact presentation that you're going to see today. This is just basically an adaptation of that.
Nicole, pause a moment, because everybody wants to clap.
Yay! I like that.
So well done. Anyway, carry on with your paper, but the room wanted to applaud you.
Thank you, appreciate it. So this study follows how everyday users domesticate digital media platforms, and I look at specifically 3 different areas: content streaming, gaming, and social media. I'll try to keep today's talk focused on content streaming, and some of the slides may not totally match up just because I'm pulling my dissertation slide deck and we can kind of discuss variances from there. So today I'm going to talk about the broader implications. I'll situate my study within domestication theory. Third, I'll talk about the methodology and methods for the study. And finally, I'll situate my findings within that conceptual framework. If we can move to the next slide, that would be fantastic. So in the early 2000s, Maria Bakker-Diva shifted the typical unit of analysis for domestication from households to networks. At the time, this made perfect sense because the early internet cultivated the promise of openness, rhizomatic extensivity, and freedom. But by the 2010s, operations that used to typify the internet were increasingly funneled through platforms. So where information used to be scattered across the web, it was now largely contained by a small umbrella of platforms, things like YouTube, Netflix, and Facebook, and so forth. So as a result, this work that I'm showing you here, it marks a departure away from networks and a return to households as the unit of analysis. Next slide, please. I think it's maybe one back. Yeah, there you go. So the overarching argument that goes through this project is that there is an imbrication between households and platforms. And I argue through the empirical observations that households and platforms both operate as moral and economic systems. Okay, you can move to the next slide. In order to situate my study, I use domestication theory, which is a social shaping theory situated as border communication at the intersection between media sociology and science and technology studies. As a metaphor, domestication refers to the taming of wild technologies, and as a practice, it refers to the process of media consumption. Domestication theory was actually influenced by a scholar named Igor Kopytov, whose work about the biography of a thing showed us how objects are impacted by their display, their plurality of meanings, and also singularization. That is, the exchange value that's only recognized by particular populations. Next slide, please. So this shift towards media ethnography is how Roger Silverstone came to lead a project in the 1980s with colleagues like David Morley and Sonia Livingston to explore how households domesticate information and communication technologies in everyday life. And for anyone who's familiar with Roger Silverstone's work, one of his first canonical texts is a text called Television in Everyday Life. So this project really riffs off of that. So Silverstone's moral economy framework includes appropriation, objectification, incorporation, and conversion. More recently, Bross and Blank have included externalization as a fifth dimension of the moral economy. I'm going to define these concepts as I move through the findings section, just in the interest of time. So if we can go to the next slide. One of the things that I find really interesting about domestication is that it situates objects as doubly articulated with material and symbolic dimensions. But despite this framing, Sonia Livingston has rightly pointed out that doubly articulated research has proved surprisingly difficult. And this point, I argue, is particularly salient in relation to digital media. Next slide, please. So in a very more recent domestication text, Maren Hartman has suggested that the complexity and contingency of modern media demands not only a return to double articulation through ethnographic work, but ideally a shift towards triple articulation. That meaning an investigation of object, text, and context. And my interpretation of this in relation to Netflix is here on the board for you. So object is actually doubly articulated is one of the things that I uncovered in this study, is that you can't actually have one object without another, i.e. the television or the smartphone or the tablet. And then whether it's Netflix or Disney Plus and so forth. The text being the shows. At the time of the 2021 data collection, Squid Game was very, very popular. And third, articulation, showing things like what time of day do people watch? Are they watching news in the evening, or are they watching Netflix in bed at night? Or are they only watching Netflix in the living room? And this has really given me a greater understanding of bedroom and living room cultures, which I'll return to. Next slide, please. So the methodology I selected for this study is digital ethnography. Ethnography is a very common methodology for domestication projects, certainly the earlier domestication projects. And the choice to use digital ethnography was really rooted in needing to find a COVID resilient study design after my project was shut down at the beginning of the pandemic. I inventively combined a set of mixed methods that included a household survey, semi-structured interviews for the household as well as individuals. I like to say there's an asterisk here, the caveat being that obviously I could only interview those who were able to speak to me. So that typically began at age 3, although I did have some chatty 2-year-olds in the study. A recorded home tour and a 1-day recorded media audit for every participant. The audio and video was then further used for participant observation. If you can turn to the next slide, I would appreciate it. So between August 2021 and November 2022, 50 households. Sorry, I'm being distracted by all the bubbles that pop up on Microsoft Teams. 50 households, a total of 151 participants located where I live in British Columbia, Canada, so the west coast of Canada, participated in platforms in everyday life. These households joined the study from a wide range of social, economic, racial, and cultural backgrounds. My study participants, as you can see here on the board, they ranged from ages 0 to 73, and these platform users lived in a variety of dwellings across our province. In the next slide, please. So for the purpose of today's talk, it's too much to talk about all 50 households. And if I had had more time, I probably would have picked a different household for all of you today. But for the purpose of this, we're just going to stick with it. This is the Miller household. And that includes Wesley, Leslie, Carter, Katie, Lincoln, and their pet dog, Bo. I actually selected this household for a number of reasons. It's a very large household. They span a wide range of ages in the data set comparatively. The household members used a very wide range of hardware platforms as well as digital media platforms, and they do use all 3 areas of the emphasis in the study, meaning content streaming, cable, gaming, and social media. A limitation to this household is certainly that they prioritize social media and gaming, but comparatively, the Millers are a very well-rounded example of how users domesticate, how households domesticate these technology and digital media platforms. We can move to the next slide. So we're going to start moving into the moral economy framework here. So this is the first of the 5 stages in the framework. An object is appropriated at the point at which it is sold and leaves the world of commodity and generalized system of equivalence and exchange. The integration of triple articulation in this phase involves an analysis of objects and text. So what I've done here is I've actually proposed, I should just back up a little bit because you haven't read the piece. I've proposed what I'm calling an articulated moral economy, meaning like let's look at the articulations in combination with this moral economy. So in terms of what the Millers have for technology platforms as objects, they have 3 televisions, a VCR, a DVD player, a PVR, a Roku, a home security system, 3 Alexas, 1 landline, 2 tablets, 2 laptops, a Dell PC, 1 printer, 1 Fitbit, an AirTag, a PlayStation 3, a PlayStation 4, a Nintendo Wii U, and a Nintendo Wii. Carter also has a custom gaming PC in his bedroom, a mechanical keyboard, a gaming headset and microphone, AirPods, a Yeti microphone. And importantly, every member of this household has an iPhone except Wesley and Katie, who have 2 iPhones. So if you can just switch to the next slide. One of the things that following these objects allowed me to do is get a really good sense of the kind of digital media that they were using. So I'm going to focus today just on the content streaming in the appropriation section. Let's start with the Millers, and then I'll explain this visual that's up on the board here. The Miller household has TELUS Optic TV. This is our version of like a high optic fiber cable that is typically integrated with other services as well, meaning like internet and landline. They have Netflix, Disney Plus, Prime Video, YouTube Premium, Plex, and Roku. What is interesting about the Miller household is that they're very similar to most other households, and you can see here on the "What Are We Watching" visual on the screen, this is how the 50 households appropriated different, and I'm using the word like quote unquote television, content streaming platforms in the study. So most households are appropriating more than one type of television right now. What is different about the Millers is that the vast majority of the households actually justify this by saying it's still cheaper than cable to subscribe to multiple content streaming services, which I thought was really, really fascinating. Because I have a little bit more time, the other thing I'll say is that there was definite patterns in consumption over what people were more likely and not likely to appropriate. So for example, my younger household were less likely to have cable. The exceptions to that were people who had it cheaper, like here in BC, a lot of Shaw and TELUS packages, if you want internet and a landline, it's going to be cheaper to also get cable. Or some people were renting where it was just included as part of the rental package. But by and large, most of the young households didn't see a need for cable unless they watched things like football or hockey on a regular basis. On the other hand, my 50 plus households, they tended to have cable and were less likely to have multiple content streaming platforms. I believe, and I'm just doing this by memory, but I believe I had 8 of the 10 senior households had Netflix, and 1 had BritBox, and 1 was actually subscribing to a content streaming service in India. So the appropriation was certainly different across the household age ranges. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things that I did for every household is I had them show me inside all of their profiles. But because Netflix has obviously emerged as a dominant platform, all of the Netflix profiles have been visualized out for this project. So you can see here some really interesting patterns. And one of the things I've tried to achieve with this visualization that I've done in conjunction with a graphic illustrator is to show this concept of triple articulation within the Netflix profile. So the object here being Netflix, the text being their favorite. So Sonia Livingston said maybe one of the ways we can solve the richness that is often lacking in today's studies compared to original TV studies is by following favorites. So I asked every participant in the study, like, what are your favorite shows? You'll notice here they're notably not all from Netflix. Katie was very quick to tell me that she prefers Disney Plus to Netflix. And I had to really pull teeth to get her to tell me some Netflix shows because she says, I watch all of Zombies, I binge watch it, and then I binge watch all of Descendants, and then I repeat this cycle. You'll notice here that Leslie has the word mommy and Wesley has the word sugar daddy. So Leslie often will change people's names to the nicknames. She's done it to the kids as well, but they tend to change their name back. What we see here is a context emerging where Netflix affords platform personalization and platform agency that cultivates identity through profile images and nicknames. Every member of the household here selected their own profile images. And you notice that, for example, Lincoln has the picture for Corey Carson as his icon, and Katie picked her favorite animal, and Carter picked an image from an anime show that he really likes. And so you can see this sort of context beginning to emerge. The purpose of the television and spatial icons and time of day icons is really to get a sense of whether they're in their bedrooms or whether they're in the living room. One thing that's really interesting in this study is that the majority of people still prefer to watch, even if they do watch on their phone or their tablet, they're still preferring to watch on a television when possible. Every single household in the data set had one of these Netflix profiles designed. And what's really been great is I've been able to develop out, and I don't have time today, but I've been able to develop out 7 types of profile typologies. So basically like those who don't have Netflix and those who share their profile icon with maybe their child or their spouse, and those who share externally with family, or those who use other people's accounts. So I'm able to see that, and some of those have flags to indicate like we have someone in Canada and the US and India sharing the same profile. But using these textual favorites that emerged here, if you can go to the next slide, one of the things I was able to do is look for TV show favorites across the data set. And so what I've done in most of my work is try to extract things into ages and stages that kind of allows us to see a level of comparability. What I'll say here is just maybe 3 main patterns, and that's that children under the age of 7 were the most likely in the data set to use the continue watching and show recommendations feature. The result is, of course, more homogeneous content consumption, and you can really see that coming through here with the visual with things like Cocomelon, Paw Patrol, and Octonauts. Users between the ages of 7 all the way into their 20s, they watch a very wide variety of shows, so it became a little bit more difficult to pinpoint this sort of homogeneity, but there were certain shows that surfaced as popular favorites. And because a lot of the data collection for this occurred in 2021, it's not really surprising that things like Squid Game and Stranger Things emerged as these kind of popular favorites. What was really fascinating is if you look at the lines from 50-year-olds upward, there was no unified show consumption, but one pattern did emerge, and I thought it was really interesting. They were the most likely to consume Netflix Originals content, and almost exclusively Netflix Original content coming in as favorites. I think this again indicates how Netflix's recommendations through algorithmic television impacts viewing practices. All right, if we can just go to the next slide. So objectification refers to the physical location and display of objects within the household environment. The articulation here, I argue, is objects in the physical spaces, following objects in physical spaces as a way to uncover those contexts. So if we can just go to the next slide for a second. This is the Miller house's blueprint. All the households have blueprints where I put key objects in the household, such as, like where's the televisions, where do they keep their charging stations, where are their beds, where is their furniture, just to get a sense of how do these people live, where do they put their technology that aids their digital media consumption. So the Miller household is actually really interesting because if you look in the kitchen here, you can see it's a definite hub for the household. And not every household's hub is the kitchen. Some people it's the master bedroom, or some people it's the office, but a lot, or the living room. But a lot of houses, it is the kitchen. So you can see here, there's 3 charging stations. You can see all of these devices. Courtois and his colleagues would describe the Miller household as a media-rich environment. And if you just span over, you can see that Carter has what we would call a media-rich bedroom. Before Carter had gaming equipment in his bedroom, he actually used to play in the television in the basement. And this is where people used to gather to watch family shows and play games together. But once Carter was no longer in the basement has now become an abandoned space, which is a really fascinating shifting dynamic in that household. What I will say is that even those teens who are exhibiting high levels of bedroom culture, one thing that's very interesting in this study is that they will still leave their bedrooms to come out to the television area in the evening. So the Netflix is kind of operating as a sort of hearth, the same way that cable once did. What I'll say is that objectification across the data set actually revealed really interesting patterns around race, gender, and equity. Single mother households were the most likely to be living in poverty, showing sort of the technologicization of poverty within households. So early domestication projects actually showed that these households would go without media technologies, meaning they would not have access. But these households are now very media-rich environments. So take one of my participants, single mothers, Leah. She lives in a 2-bedroom apartment. She has a 2- and 3-year-old who share one bedroom, and not only that, they share one crib. The teen daughter lives in another room. She has another child who no longer lives at home. Her children have 4 different fathers who are spread across the country. She has very little financial assistance and is living in subsidized housing. In her house, there is a really big flat screen TV that is mounted on the wall. She has a computer, she has a phone, she has AirPods, but Leah has no bed to sleep on. And I think that really shows the priority of technology in the household compared to earlier domestication projects. If we can move into incorporation, the next slide. So, moving away from objectification, which is those spatial elements, I next move into incorporation, which is concerned with temporal dimensions. What I will say here is that I kind of went rogue a little bit, because one of the largest complaints with domestication and even digital media studies to date has been the lack of richness that people have been able to uncover around space-time dimensions. So what I decided to do, and you can go to the next slide here, is I have incorporated the space-time dimensions here, as well as 2 different types of objects, hardware and platforms. And you can see here that Carter and Katie consume the majority of their digital media in their bedrooms, and other household members are in their communal spaces. And this is a really important pattern that has emerged because it shows a really nuanced understanding of bedroom and living room cultures. If you can move to the next slide, please. Now, I just want to point out that these lines are actually drawing inspiration from a research method that's under review with me and Dr. Frederick Lesage at New Media and Society that will hopefully be out later this year. And these spot lines were used as a way to show what households were doing, but then to also extract them from those lines and then put them together with other common age ranges. So for example, here is Carter and the other 13 to 15-year-olds in the study who are similar to him. What you see here is persistent media consumption across multiple platforms throughout the day. Snapchat emerges as the most common form of social media. 50% of the 13 to 15-year-olds in the study play at least 1 game per day, and 5% use content streaming platforms regularly, with the majority preferring YouTube. And that's a pretty common trend in the study, is that the younger people are actually watching YouTube more than they are content streaming. Okay, moving into the next slide, we look at conversion. Conversion relates to the flow between private households and public worlds, the way an artifact is conversed back from private to public meanings. And if you can go to the next slide. So in more, so unfortunately here I have a TikTok example, which is just really, if you think about the way conversion used to work and like the way that Roger Silverstone would describe it around television, that still happens. So people will watch a show like Squid Game and then they'll go to school and talk about it with their friends, or there'll be tensions in the household that build because a parent will say, I talked to this other parent and they say it's not okay for you to watch it, so I'm not going to let you watch it either. And so you see that happening, but it's typically been conversing family life on display through the public television set. And social media is kind of reversing this, allowing households to then put themselves out here, as we see from this viral video that one of the households made. But this became another pattern in the data set, these sort of TikTok dads making these videos of family life and consumption. Okay, moving to the next slide. Is externalization. According to Bross and Blank, this looks at the connected devices in each other's domestication, often through smart speaker assistants. Integrating articulation into this phase often looks at the connection between objects and text. And if you can just flip to the next slide. Typically, I noticed this externalization happening in relation to smart speakers. So for example, here, Katie walks over to Alexa and says, "I love you." Alexa responds in song with saying, "Thank you for saying I love you." Katie then asks, "Alexa, are you my best friend?" And this conversation actually occurred for several minutes before I interrupted it, really showing that companionship between human and device. Now, I also have built off of Bross and Blank's ideas here using Sindin Ling and some other people in sound externalization to really think about how audio is externalized. And one of the things that jumped at me when I was looking at the data set were these people who were using a Netflix party. So this boyfriend and girlfriend in their 20s, a 20-year-old university student, 20-year-old boyfriend living in another apartment, in order to hang out on Friday nights. One thing they would do is they would watch a Netflix show together, and they would do that through the Netflix party where they could have a chat. So they would be basically one person sharing Netflix, but then it would be identical on both screens and able to pause it. And that became kind of date night for them. So a sort of sound externalization from one space to another mediated through a computer and chat box. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so my conclusions are basically triple articulation doesn't work perfectly, but it actually worked surprisingly well. The best place it worked was actually in relation to content streaming platforms like Netflix, Disney. It was very easy to separate those articulations, much harder with gaming and social media. I think this study is really interesting because it offers a more holistic ethnographic perspective on platforms, especially things like content streaming platforms. And then there was some really interesting observations that came from the empirical analysis that really show how households and platforms both operate as these containers that operate on free labor. They both have fluid categories. They both have variable entities. They both form social units. They both are built on sort of moral and value systems, and they both operate as a type of economic unit. And I think that was really interesting. Well, thank you for listening. I hope I haven't taken more than 20 minutes, and I look forward to hearing Gustavo's work.
Thank you, Nicole. Let me click lots of buttons so I can get to the right. Correct, isn't it? Let's not share. And so next is Gustavo Daudt Fischer from UNISINOS in Brazil. We haven't tried out if you can share, so let's see if you can.
Yeah.
Hopefully this will.
Sure. Thank you guys for having me today. It's a pleasure to be in your event. I can share my screen here if it's okay.
Yep.
We do use Microsoft Teams around here, so I guess things will.
We're fine. We can see that. You, so whenever you're ready,
okay.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. So, congrats, Nicole, on your presentation and also on your dissertation being approved and everything else. It's so important this time in our careers. Well, my name is Gustavo. I work at UNISINOS. It's a Jesuit university. I will try to be on time here as well. My presentation has maybe more questions than findings, and I am supported also by these two governmental agencies that help fund my research. So this is my university. Since I'm from Brazil, maybe not all of you are familiar. So it's a Jesuit university, has two campuses, one in the countryside, another in our capital, in our state. We are very near Uruguay and Argentina. Maybe you're familiar because of the recent World Cup winners. So my broad question on my research, regardless of this theme specifically, is how to collaborate with a media studies perspective on the dimension of media archives in online environments. That's been my interest for quite some time, and I am really fond of some concepts that are important for me, such as the idea of memory as a more dialectic perspective of remembering, forgetting, just as Pierre Nora reminds us. Also vulnerable to manipulations and appropriations. So memory is not something static, fixed. And when we see that on online environments, this approach becomes even more meaningful. Also, an important idea by Wendy Chun when she discusses computation culture and digital culture is that this idea of an enduring ephemerality, which makes us think that also, like memory, computational content is not always fixed. On the contrary, digital media fades, but it does stays, but in a like a permanent and impermanent situation. We all are familiar with that when we come up with dead websites or deleted pictures on social media posts. My theoretical and methodological approach also has a lot to do with media archaeology, which is a broad field to look into media, but I'm very much interested in trying to look at alternative histories of suppressed, neglected, and forgotten media, and trying to think of the excavation as the best metaphor to think about that in terms of recovering artifacts and also trying to bring up memorial dimensions, such as layers that we can analyze our objects in this kind of context. I hope my English is sufficient for this understanding. Before I delve into what actually my research is doing, it is important to situate that in Brazil we have major television networks. The most important one is Global Television, which maybe can be compared to a big platform player in terms of Brazilian territory. And Global is an example of how platforms try to control their own memory. So they used to have a television show called Video Show where they would air extracts and fragments of their work on other shows, telenovelas, reality shows, or other programs, and trying to come up with the celebrity culture within their star system. And afterwards, they came up with a channel on cable network called Viva, where uh, they rebroadcast old telenovelas, old comedy shows, and old reality shows. And so they're trying to put their memory, their content from other times in a more commercial use. They do have a website called Global Memory where they try to come up with what they think it's important about their own history. And Globo is known as sort of a kingmaker in Brazil. They support some candidates for presidential nominees, and others they try to come up with, I won't say fake news, but sometimes they try to come up with different versions of what they're saying. So in this Global Memory website, they try to answer some accusations that they get from time to time regarding that. And finally, on streaming wars issue, they also came up with their own streaming platform, and also where they rebroadcast lots of content that they own and also other contents from other international networks as well. So the different ways of television content being thought as archives, being reissued to a program, to a different channel, to a website, or to a streaming platform. But my concern is that there are lots of contents that are spread out on different platforms, not the ones that are owned by the networks, such as YouTube and Instagram, because people are interested in preserving or maybe trying to share by because they are fond of their program, of some programs, or maybe nostalgic about something that is not being aired anymore. So my project is called LabMem. It's Memory Lab of Online Media, in online media. So my idea is to look at how peripheral audiovisual media content developed in Brazil within the scope of broadcast TV present themselves in platforms such as YouTube and Instagram, and how the idea of media memory is being challenged by these kind of appearances. So we try to investigate formats, memory online, mainly online, of memory constructs and online environments in order to develop, and that's something that we are probably going to do by next year, new arrangements and collections for these excavated materials. So we can think about lots of audiovisual TV content from peripheral channels in Brazil, the ones that maybe are extinct, or maybe they were bought by a bigger network and don't exist with that under that name anymore. And then we find hundreds of archives in that sense, such as this one. This is from my city here in Porto Alegre, a channel that doesn't exist anymore. But then as we gather this material from YouTube, we found that people are interested in saving little bits of programs, maybe a vignette just of the trademark of the channel on the left side of the on the top, and the left side on green, you can see it. So, and maybe sometimes even they record it in black and white, and these different forms of archiving came to our interest, and we try to see what does it say about online media and online and television archives as well. So maybe a recording that shows a glitch on the video. Even these things are important. Videos with 12 seconds, 15 seconds sometimes, which make us interrogate what are these collections about. Also, we do have on Instagram an example of people interested in preserving Brazilian MTV from the 90s, which is considered the MTV that was the best version of MTV in Brazil, with more experimental shows, with more a Brazilian approach to a international network such as MTV. So through Instagram, they repost old content from that time, and also they come up with websites that try to recreate the same broadcasts through YouTube or maybe through other platforms of social media. So we are gathering this material using Excel to come up with the web links and the description, and trying to also come up with some statistics, such as this one from a local channel as well, that shows that the channel was extinct in 2016, and that was a coincidence with the lack of posting from people that were uploading archives from that channel. So we found out that from 2007 to 2015, the videos posted for this channel were posted by people who were interviewed in news shows. So the people who are being interviewed for their own probably 15 minutes Andy Warhol moment, they posted these videos, and afterwards we see a return still with a low amount of videos of people posting with preservation intent. So until 2015, it was more people posting as their own portfolio, and from 2018 on, the posts are dealing with something regarding preservation, nostalgia, and other meanings towards that. So some of the issues that I want to discuss regarding this idea of looking at this fragmented, scattered material of television from Brazil, spreaded on platforms such as YouTube and Instagram, make me think about, and considering the theoretical approach that I try to summarize in the beginning of my talk, the idea that there's an ephemerality at play, because at the same time we have two layers of this ephemeral state: the flux of the television. TV is flow as we know it, and therefore television doesn't want to be archived, and also inspired by Wendy Chun, digital media's enduring ephemerality. So these two layers of the state of ephemerality are interesting to think about when they are somehow upon each other. And what I think about is that the behavior of online media archives it does not allow us to settle comfortably into a fixed past. We have to, as Snowden Becker would say, to hack media so it can be preserved against its own will. Media wants to be ephemeral. Media wants to quote unquote disappear, and the idea of working against that, it also seems to be something interesting that these fragmented materials shows us. And also, an important question is what should be archived? Who should do it? Because if we want to think, and if we want to consider YouTube as the salvation for lost television memory, maybe we should think about, should we preserve everything like people are doing with their own criteria, little fragments, opening of shows, something that they like, regardless if the audience was huge or not. So maybe there's a piece missing between the librarian archivist approach and the computer scientist approach. Maybe will artificial intelligence solve this by coming up with some sort of computer code that will make everything be archived at a fast pace? Or should we think about what should we curate in terms of television archives? Rick Prelinger, which is a very important audiovisual archivist from San Francisco, reminds us that YouTube is building a default clip culture, and its interface is surrounded by invitations to move around a lengthy lecture. The interface wants you to play with it constantly. So we are always switching between videos, and also because maybe public archives have some sort of difficult access by, let's say, the common audience. YouTube is becoming the idea of a catalog, because they sometimes reach places that traditional archives do not reach. But I would say that the only thing that YouTube wants to preserve is itself. So everything that's inside YouTube in terms of television content being uploaded by these counter collectors, these people who have this initiative on their own. All these things work as merchandise for YouTube, like for them to build up their own affordances upon it. YouTube doesn't have a concern about how it is becoming a different sort of archive. At least that's an idea that I want to bring, since the theme of this conference deals with this idea of power. When I was presenting these ideas on University of California, Irvine, as I was taking my sabbatical year, one person asked me about, isn't YouTube now a place where people want to only watch gamers streaming their content and their gameplay? Just Nicole mentioned that a couple of minutes ago. And that made me think about what would YouTube prefer and what will it stimulate with this algorithm. And maybe this part of YouTube that is being used by people with preservation intentions, or maybe collector intentions, maybe it'll be, I don't know, be subsided. It will be maybe it will disappear in time. So where will we going with this idea of the counter collectors and the people who are with their own intents collecting things that maybe usual archives are not doing? Another idea is this idea of from junk to gold, which also comes from the author Michael Thompson, and television archives that appear counter-collected or counter-preserved on platforms. They sometimes are partial, edited with technical marks, traces of hardware, and home recording distortions that we could call it rubbish on a first look, but maybe these tiny pieces somehow become at some point being heated up by some trend, by some TikTok challenge. I'm not a TikTok dad yet, but I think sometimes we can think about these fragments that looking rubbish become gold because they are somehow they get back because there's some news regarding that personality on on mainstream media that make people look around and try to find things from the past on these fragments. Some final remarks also about this idea that maybe the memory of a television channel is not only its news programs, reality TV shows, or sitcoms, but also the parts we won't find by only hoping for Global Play to upload them, or Netflix to upload them, or maybe other streaming platforms. But sometimes maybe it's interesting to think about commercial breaks, opening titles, vignettes, earthquake alerts, such as the ones that we find on, especially on American television. So are these things worth being archived to tell us a little bit about a time, well, where we were being alerted about some things going on in terms of our climate? So these are important questions, I guess. And also, if media television archives in online environments are placed in a tension between these declaratively preservationist initiatives, such as the ones that we can find on universities. UCLA has a big one, and other universities around North America and Europe, and also Latin America. And this irregular, non-curated growth of collectors of fragments, and strongly linked to the affordances and the power of YouTube and Instagram and others, and the explicitly commercial presence in streaming platforms. So the idea that I am accessing television memory towards Netflix or other platforms such as Global Play, maybe we should emphasize this tension in these initiatives that would call attention to these issues, and that will demand dealing with the apparatus as Willem Flusser would like it, but maybe not dealing in the way that we only do what the apparatus tells us, but really trying to tinker with it and trying to hack it a little bit and try to see what comes to attention with that, which would mean a more interdisciplinary approach when we are studying these events. One idea in this sense is maybe we should think about broadcasting a playlist of TV fragments, just as Rick Prelinger does with his project called Lost Landscapes of San Francisco, which he calls performative live cinema, because he goes to audiences in like theaters or other places, and he starts screening these images that don't have sound, and he waits for the audience to come up with opinions, laughter, questions, and in this screen that we have on the right, during the pandemic, he was explaining to the people who were watching this performative live cinema within their homes about how this works. You are invited to ask questions, identify people, places, and engage in discussion with your neighbors. And that I just one day had the final quote from Henry Langlois, the founder of Cinémathèque Française: "The best way to preserve film is to project it." So maybe we have to find how to project things in this plethora of content that is fragmented toward around our social media, websites, and streaming platforms. Thank you very much. These are my contacts, and I'm very happy to be here once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo. I'll invite Nicole, if you want to, Nicole, sorry, if you want to put your camera back on so we can see you, and then we can move into a kind of discussion and questions and so on. While people here are formulating questions, I just want to say thank you to both of you for these talks, but also thank you for doing these projects. Like Nicole, as someone who's a fan of those kind of early ethnographic studies, which actually is foundational to television studies projects, it's brilliant to see someone who's doing work like that, bringing it to date and placing it in these contemporary, very situated, very specific contexts. And Gustavo, it always seems to me that television, for such a kind of dominant global medium, we're so ignorant of its history and its past, and we don't pay attention to archiving it in the way we can do to a whole range of other media. And I'm aware of that myself, and when I've done little bits of television history, completely discovered that television's past is not what I thought it was. So that idea of thinking about how we kind of archive and is great, and it seems like both papers are kind of talking about, okay, how do we study television and television studies and all those kinds of things. All right, I've rambled on, but I just want to say thank you, because I'm really happy that projects like this are happening.
Can I quickly
There's questions that I have. But I'll invite the audience, and of course, Nicole and Gustavo, if you've got questions for each other, then you can too. Do you have a question?
No, it was just
Come on, so that people can see.
I just wanted to ask.
Just come up so people can, if you're asking. Over here.
Okay, oh my.
Oh, there you
go. Hiya.
If you're asking questions, I'll ask.
No, so just carrying on from Brett, I think, Gustavo, what the use of these places like YouTube and that, I think for archiving content from the global south, I think that's really important, but then making it accessible globally as well, if that makes sense. I think that access or the preservation of the content from the global south, I think is really quite key and really quite important. I hope that's kind of made sense. I know that.
But
Still
then again,
formulating.
it's on an American platform. And
That's true, but
I
why not put it
Right, we're having a
somewhere?
conversation, this is confusing.
I have a question from Nicole.
But yeah, no, it wasn't a question, it was just kind of a little carry on from what you were saying about like the importance of this. That's all it was. But questions?
Did you have a question?
Yes.
Do you want to come up and ask the
Yes.
question? You should probably also introduce yourself so that people know who you speak.
Okay, I'm not sure. Hi, I'm Julia. Thank you both for your papers. I joined what was just said about the importance of looking at those topics. My question is for Nicole. If I spotted correctly, the ages of the children who watched Squid Game are from like 7 to something, which struck me as perhaps the wrong age for that show. And that brings me to my question of parental control, or parental control over the devices and over the use of the devices, as in you're allowed to watch it, but only in the sort of more shared spaces, so they can sort of keep an eye on what the children actually watch, or I don't know, anything to do with sort of parental involvement or mediation of the content that the children watch. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic question. As I was putting that together, my 7 and 9-year-old said, "But we're not allowed to watch Squid Game." And I said, "No, you are not." But basically, I think the controls are there in some households and not in others. I think the apparatus, the infrastructure is built, but what parents and households choose to do with that varies dramatically. What I will say is that there were certain patterns that emerged where there were more surveillance and controls put into certain households. Those households, the children were not allowed to play things like Grand Theft Auto at age 5 and 6, but that was happening in certain other households. Squid Game was definitely being watched extensively in a few households with 7 and 8-year-olds. And then you'd go into other households and there'd be 13 and 14-year-olds and the parents would say, absolutely not. So those kind of choices, I don't think relate necessarily to the controls in place so much as Roger Silverstone so poignantly reminded us almost 20 years ago about the morality that is based around media and the decisions that households make in determining what constitutes moral media in the construction of that household. So one of the things that I tried really hard to do in this study is to extract my own opinions here and allow the agency to unfold as it did, whether they were 7 or whether they were 30, allowing them to say, here's what I do and how I do it and why I do it. But, you know, I should also point out that there was in this Miller household, the 5-year-old, he said to me, he said, I watched Squid Game. And I said, you do? Tell me about that. And he said, well, and he didn't get counted, by the way, because he doesn't actually watch it. He said, well, I saw the cover and it looks fun and there's lots of games in it, but he had never seen it before. But because he has older siblings, there was that wanting to do it. And that brings me to another point, is that if there are older siblings in a household, the content consumption becomes more elevated with the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th child. It just, by the time they hit the 3rd child, they're like, we used to not let them watch it, but now they can do whatever their older sibling does. So these kind of progressive changes in households definitely occur.
Yeah, as the youngest child of three, I definitely benefited from that in terms of a whole set of things. I wanted to ask both of you, it was really good that both of these projects are kind of very context specific in terms of geography. Gustavo, you talking about Brazil, and obviously Nicole, a very specific place, particular region in Canada. This might be an unfair thing to ask, but I'm wondering if you can speculate to what extent the things that you have talked about in each of your talks are only applicable to that region, or might say something more broader about television, or maybe a larger region, North America or South America or something, or global. Can these things be applied somewhere else, or would you want to make an argument that actually there's components of this which are very, very local and would only kind of function here? Gustavo, I don't know if you want to go first.
Sure, thank you for the question. I think it is an important one, and I would go on saying yes. I think it is probably we would find people from maybe Canada uploading fragmented content from television shows, old television shows. Our relationship with media in that sense, I guess, is similar. Maybe it will differ in how this content is being used, or maybe what type of content is being uploaded. In Brazil, telenovelas is something that has an important role in what we do, and also sports. And maybe in other countries it is different. But in terms of how the online archive, or the online media archive, is being used or being uploaded or being scattered around, I think it's an interesting perspective to think that there are global characteristics that we could try to find similarities.
Do you think there's any which are solely Brazilian? Are there any kind of contexts where you would want to say, no, I think this only happens here, or has a particular inflection here?
I'm not sure if I got it, but I think the thing is that maybe we have more things being extincted in Brazil, because there's buying of bigger networks buying smaller ones, and maybe this perspective is not as much as the one that we see in other places. And also, of course, Brazil has a problem of trying to deal with its own memory because of public investments and the lack of it. And so maybe in some sense, people are trying to substitute the initiative that should be from public or other academic places with their own particular intents.
Okay, that's really useful. Nicole, for your project, does it tell us something broader, or is it specifically local, or?
No, of course, this is just speculation, because you can't say until you do it somewhere else. But I would say that my study would probably hold across Canada and the US. A lot of our consumption is very similar. Obviously, Netflix Canada has different types of shows, but really, for the most part, the popular ones are the same in the US and Canada. The only variance, I think, would be in the particular cable offerings. I think we have Shaw and TELUS. Other places have different service offerings, so that might impact it to some extent. But what I will say is that everything Gustavo said was also appearing in my study. So that's really fascinating in the conversations, that fragmented going to seek out old nostalgic shows on YouTube was an enormous thing that people were doing. And that kind of 16 and below range, they really were preferring YouTube. Sometimes even the parents would put them on YouTube and say, I want you to watch Sesame Street because I watched it when I was a child. And I mean, obviously Sesame Street's a little different because they have this enormously curated channel, but going to find, I don't have this, so I'm going to find this particular Friends episode, or I'm going to go find this. So there was a lot of going to find fragmented old TV or movies and watching it there. So I think a lot of parallels, and I found the way that you structured that really beautiful.
This is for Nicole. I found your, when you said that the basement has become, in the Miller household, has become a neglected space. I found that really interesting because there was an article like maybe 20 years ago that I looked at, which was by Nandita Bhattacharya, who talked about American Indian diasporic women using the basement as their space to watch Indian films, popular Hindi language films. But obviously this was at a time pre-streaming, pre-YouTube, all that stuff. And I think they were largely doing it through cable channels. But I think she was kind of framing it as the basement being this woman's domestic private viewing space. So I found that really interesting. Like, did you find in your families, were there spaces that were used previously but are now being neglected? Is that kind of a thing that you found across the board because of the mobility of screens, I suppose? Or I don't know, can you talk more about that? I think the spatial aspect of it.
Yeah, the spatial aspect of this is fascinating. I would not say that that was standard in the data set. Most households use the space they have, especially because where we live, housing is very expensive and space is tight. But they live in a very large household, so I guess maybe they didn't need it and they just spend most of the time in the main living room. Maybe as the kids get older, they'll reappropriate that space. What I will say is that I didn't find across the 50 households a single dedicated space for women to watch shows, only women. That was not true for men. It became a very, very gendered dynamic. So I had a lot of men in my study who had man caves in the basement, who had hockey posters all over, beer bottles all over. I even have one participant who had a custom designed shed in his backyard with the sign man cave on the door, Apple TV on the wall, and a couch put into his backyard so that he could be alone and watch whatever he wanted without anyone. So that space ended up unfolding for men, but never for women. There was one woman who had a sewing and craft room, but that room actually was completely taken over with the child's toys when I went into it. So it was supposed to be her space, but then it was completely infiltrated with the child's things.
Oh, interesting.
And connected to that gendered component, one of you will probably know I can't remember which study it is that did the ethnographic work, which kind of found that women very often were doing domestic chores while watching television because they felt guilty relaxing in the home.
Yeah.
Because it's a space of work, whereas men could have man caves because it's a space of leisure. Again, it'd be interesting to know. I mean, that study, if I remember, was decades ago. It's the same thing. It's the same thing applying. Were women kind of talking about, I don't know, that sense of guilt and that sense of kind of, I'm not allowed to relax in the home because it's a workspace.
A lot of women in the study said, I don't have time for that. And that was in relation to everything but social media. There was always time for social media. But in terms of gaming, women, like mothers in their 30s and 40s, were the least likely to engage in that unless it was integrated into social media. They were more likely to do chores when their kids were watching shows. What was very fascinating was actually not that, but what the university students were doing. And that was that they'd come home from a long day and they'd put their phone on and they'd put multiple screens in their phones and they'd actually watch like Netflix on the top, play a game at the bottom while they're like cooking dinner or doing other things. So I found the university students were actually the most fragmented viewers in the study.
I know that Purnima Mankakar talks about Indian women in Delhi through her ethnographic research and about some of them like as in have to be doing something, and even through that also through my ethnographic study I found that even though the women in my study, sorry I'm talking about my research now, they found time to watch TV but yet did find like, oh, I should be chopping some vegetables or ironing or doing it. There were a few times where they did just watch TV, but sometimes would scroll onto social media and things like that. And it was always in the evening, but after in their minds, I have done my day's work. I'm going to sit and watch TV in the main lounge. These are older women as well that I looked at. I'm going to sit in the main lounge and watch my TV. So it was very much kind of a, this is my time now, kind of thing, yeah. So yeah, so I don't, like, that's just kind of commenting on what you said, Brett. But yeah.
The other question I was going to ask you both, because it's interesting the connection between two about kind of ideas of memory, and Gustavo, you talked about ephemerality, and it's kind of interesting, Gustavo, you're talking about recapturing memories, and Nicole, it's as if the study you're doing is the moment at which memories are being created. So, you know, 10 years down the line, Gustavo will be capturing all the stuff that you're looking at. Yeah, Nicole, there's kind of a relationship between the two. And I was given this as a television studies conference. I'm always obsessed with trying to think about the specificity of television, but I also worry that sometimes I might overplay that and think television is different from everything else because it's what I'm interested in, so I want to suggest it's like unique. Do you think, again, this is kind of a speculative question, and it is to both of you, is there something television specific here? Is that ephemerality or idea of memory? And that might connect, you know, the ways in which archives function, and it might connect to what I said earlier about we don't archive television in the way in which we archive other kinds of things. And obviously that's what your project is trying to rectify, Gustavo. Is there something specific about television which has which inflects idea of memory and ephemerality, which is different from other forms of media, but also maybe broadly other forms of culture? I'm sorry, that's a really big, horrible question.
I'll try to speculate here on two different approaches. I would say if we are looking for a television specificity and how it would relate to memory, to how it is archived or the state of the television archive. In terms of digital environment, I would go in maybe a Friedrich Kittler approach to say that everything is zeros and ones, and the archive of television is as ephemeral as website archives or radio archives of film archives when they are uploaded and are circulated on these platforms. This is one idea, maybe more pessimistic. And the other one is that the digital environments and the platforms are reinforcing that regardless of our traditional, I would say traditional, let's say my 80s generation that used to have one television set at home and everybody would be watching it together, discussing, which we still do that, but with other things going on as well, other screens and other platforms. I would say that we use a term here in our research that it's developed by a colleague of mine, Susanna Kilp. It's called televisualities, which would mean like aspects of television that endure in other circumstances, other media, if we would like to say in that sense, regardless of the original, let's say, quote unquote television. So if we think about the way that television has a montage very very fast or with short clips, usually we are talking about some sort of television that we are used to see and endures in other spaces. Every time it endures in another platform, it also becomes something different, but it has some sort of a television DNA in it, sort of speaking. So that's why this has to do with other concepts like remediation, the McLuhan perspective as a medium engulfs the other. So I would go on this sense. There's a memory on television that endures in other media, other platforms, other circumstances, and it endures every time different, but with a memory, let's say the media memory, not the memory of an old show but the memory of a aesthetic, of a montage, of a way of transmitting, a televisionness, something like that, if we translate to English. And on the other hand, everything is bits and bytes, and I guess this tension, it maybe is what we have to think about.
Okay, thank you. Nicole?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Gustavo has just said. One of the points that I argue is that television constructs basically an ontological security for people throughout their lives. So when I interview the 70-year-olds, they talk about what it was like to watch television as a child in their household, and then what it was like to raise their kids and take them to Blockbuster. And then having their own kids now sitting in front of streaming services. And so I would argue that that sort of ontological security, and I can't remember exactly who I'm borrowing from, but I think it's maybe Burgess and someone. But this idea, no, it's Easy Parici says there's a structure of feelings that emerges around a structure of affordances. And I think that that memory kind of constructs. So the type of television set, it might change throughout their lives, but overall that memory forms and it becomes this sort of security and family bonding throughout their lives. I don't know what Gustavo would say about that, but I'd be interested to know.
I like this idea of ontological security. I think it's an interesting way of thinking of television as companionship, or something that in Brazil radio plays that role, or used to play that role a lot for people. But I think television also has this huge importance in that sense. And sometimes it's hard to grab this idea of what that security would mean in detail, but I think it's a good approach to think about it. I think we, in this panel, we have like a more aesthetic language focus approach from my side, and the idea of the behavior of audiences through Nicole's. I have also a comment, because recently we saw that Twitter doesn't allow us anymore to do research, closing its academic API. And I was wondering, what do you think about how your research is going to reach the platforms that you were asking people about? Because Netflix also sort of doesn't like to show us a lot about how it works. What are the shows that they are trying to push to us? We only can think about that with researchers like yours. So I was wondering if you think about showing them this kind of results.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And actually, algorithmic television is really on my mind, just in terms of like the platform really has this power. And I think you're talking about that power dynamic as well. But those content streamers have just as much power to show us what they want to show us. And it might feel like selection, but it is very curated. In terms of like Netflix has really cracked down on password sharing in Canada. So that hasn't happened worldwide yet, but it certainly has happened here. And last month, I actually had the privilege of re-interviewing 15 households that I had interviewed in 2021. So I got to ask them questions like, well, how did that impact you? And one household said, well, I ended up paying so that my daughter could use it as well. And another person said, basically, we're still using it and they haven't actually cracked down on us, even though they said they were going to. And another family said, well, our family's in Israel and they have the main account and they aren't cracking down on passwords there, so it's not affecting us here in Canada yet. So I think by just listening to their stories about how things are, we're starting to build these interesting new storylines about, just because Netflix says they're cracking down, what does it actually look like for the viewer, which is kind of like opening that black box that I think you're talking about that is really difficult to get at.
I've got sort of a final, in a way, it's a methodological question, but it connects actually back to the question asked before about television specificity. And this is going to sound like a pompous question because I'm going to ask how you define television, but I don't mean that in some abstract way. I mean it genuinely in a methodological way. And I'm kind of asking that, Nicole, it's kind of interesting. I gave a paper a few months ago somewhere where I was talking about television And I talked about YouTube, and a number of people in the room said YouTube is not television. If you're talking about television, you're not allowed to talk about YouTube. And I was kind of, this is interesting. We've allowed Netflix to be very clearly be understood as television, but not YouTube. And I sat there trying to work out what the difference was between the two. But there is a kind of, I could grasp the cultural, and like there's something about YouTube that doesn't feel like television, and there's something about Netflix that does. So I'm wondering how you made that distinction. But also, Gustavo, I want to ask you the same question, because clearly you must have had to decide how are we defining television in order to decide what are we archiving and what are we not archiving. Have you had to have those conversations about whether there's any kind of material which sits in some borderland and you can't go, well, are we interested in this or are we not interested in this? So Nicole, do you want to go first? Has that been a problem?
Certainly, this was something that I grappled with a great deal, because there are researchers who say Netflix is not a platform, but YouTube is, or Netflix is certainly a platform, and just like YouTube. But I argue in my position is that Netflix is situated more like a platform than it is something like HBO, and YouTube and Netflix have incredible infrastructural similarities. That said, I was very conscious and deliberate about how I was going to tease out who used YouTube as television. So that infographic you looked at only includes households that actually watch some shows. So that doesn't include, everyone in the study used YouTube. Everyone used it. I mean, 100% of the households used YouTube. But the percentage there that you see creeping up those are people who are actually going on to watch Cocomelon, to watch Miss Rachel. I mean, I'm naming the kids shows right now, but I also have a subset of people who, there's this British sitcom I want to watch and I can't find it anywhere and I only want to watch that, so I'm going to go to YouTube to find it. And I'm just going to pass that over to Gustavo because I think that's a full enough answer.
Well, regarding YouTube itself, I think when you think about YouTube's history, it started with that tagline, "Broadcaster Self." So it was trying to inherit something from television. The name itself also gives us that. When you have the opportunity to build a channel on YouTube, it's also a television metaphor right there. When YouTube has a button where you can have a theatrical view of the content, then you don't see the comments or the related videos, but you see it in full screen. So these things show us that YouTube, as much as other initiatives on the web, they come with this genealogy of different audiovisual devices or means of representation that we are dealing with since, I don't know, the beginning of history. So I think the discussion of if something is or isn't television maybe should be challenged by this idea of what potentialities or affordances of television are being put into a different mix that's coming up with a different platform. I think these things may be a way of showing the way that television endures regardless of a TV set that we used to have in our homes. And just a final comment, in my research, I make a focus on extinct television channels. So the criteria is they had to have a life before on broadcast television in order to interest me in terms of online archives.
Nicole, yeah.
Gustavo, I just had a question for you because I'm so curious about the archiving process in these ephemeral platforms. And I know that YouTube is obviously a site for this, but what does your research tell you about other places like Instagram or like Facebook even, or TikTok? Like, are there other archival zones, or maybe Vimeo? Like, I don't know, but like, what other spaces are becoming or have the potential to become even these great sort of archival spaces?
Of course, there are other places such as TikTok, sometimes even traditional websites built with online tools in a more 90s sort of way. But what comes to my attention is that when we start looking at these different platforms, we see different approaches towards the idea of the archive. The archive is not pure anymore, is also a construct. So Brazil is very well known by building lots of funny memes using what we call shorts from television content and rebuilding it and inserting it sometimes with stand-up comedy routine or maybe something that's going on social media as a trend. So if we are looking for a museum approach of preserving television, what's happening on these platforms are completely different. The more tradition, I would say YouTube would be the more traditional way of preserving compared to these other structures that we can find things on. So I think it's something regarding Instagram is talking to maybe a part of the audience that is more interested in the Instagram experience of remembering things than the YouTube one, maybe because of the specific affordances of Instagram for sharing and maybe remixing content. Who would say that YouTube became something more hard to manipulate?
Is there any other questions? We're a few minutes early, but I mean, this schedule was set up for 3 papers and only 2, and I think we've kind of thrown enough questions at you, so we could finish a few minutes early if that's.
I've just remembered what you were talking about. It was David Morley's Family Television. That's what it was. That's yeah. And then the other stuff came later on the back of David Morley. Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just ask to finish up where we can get hold of this stuff. Nicole, is this stuff being published anywhere? I know this was you said this was your thesis, can we get hold of it anywhere, or where's it going?
Where can we read more?
You'll have to wait until I turn it into a book, but I was told yesterday that it's very close to just being a manuscript in its current form, so hopefully it won't take me too much work.
Cool, that's really good. And Gustavo, how can we access this archive and see all this material?
Well, there are many things in Portuguese, of course, but I do have the Instagram account of the project that I put in the last slide. I can put it in the chat here again. And so from time to time we publish there, and hopefully I'll have a couple of things in English going on this year as well. So I'll be in touch with you guys to spread the word.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks for 2 really, really interesting papers. And I know I already said it, but I'll say it again. It's just fantastic to know that people doing projects like these, using these kinds of methods and the specificity of television and all that kind of stuff. It's really, really great. So thanks for joining us, and also thanks because it's good to have such a mix of kind of international panels and to hear perspective.
Yeah.
We can sit here in Britain and obsess over the UK and Europe and stuff like that. So it's fantastic to hear about work happening in other places. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Really great papers.
Thanks for having us.
Well done again.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.